Ladies and gentlemen, you speak and we listen. We recently took a survey about our podcast and we asked the question, what topics would you like us to cover? Who would you like us to have on? And I got one request to talk about the Crusades. Yeah, we haven't talked much about the Crusades here on this program, not recently anyway. So we're jumping in right away. I immediately thought of my friend Bill Federer, who has written books on this topic, related to this topic. And it is a topic that I think is largely misunderstood. There are people out there who think that the Crusades are how Christianity actually got started, when that certainly isn't the case. And they don't understand the context of what happened during the Crusades. And they also don't know really what did happen on the Crusades. Much of it was horrific. We'll talk about that as we go. But how did we even get to the point where people were saying, we got to take up arms for Christ? When did this happen? Who ordered it? And what happened? And nobody is better to discuss this than my friend Bill Federer. Here he is again, ladies and gentlemen, the great Bill Federer. Bill, how are you?
Hey, Frank, great to be with you.
Always great to be with you. We just happened to run into one another last week in Dallas. We were at the National Religious Broadcasters Convention, and we were both being interviewed by the great Jack Hibbs.
Yes.
And we just had a minute to talk. And once I got this survey, and someone said, "Hey, let's talk about the Crusades a little bit," I said, "Hey, let's invite Bill on to talk about it." Bill, I think in order to understand the context of the Crusades, and let's just start by saying the Crusades did not begin until 1095 AD. So they had nothing to do with the spread of Christianity in the first 1,000 years. So let's just get that out of the way. But they were a response to Muslim aggression in the Holy Land. So why don't we start with Islam? Because we have to understand the context as to why these Crusades some people thought were necessary. So talk about Islam a little bit, and then we'll get into the Crusades later in the program.
Oh, right. So if we look at the Middle East, the Jews controlled Judea from King David, 1000 BC on, and then the area was controlled by the Romans, and then the Roman Empire became Christian under Constantine. And so now you have a Christian Roman Empire in the West, and on the East you had Persians. They were Zoroastrian, and there was a 1,000-year war between the Romans and the Persians. They beat each other up and left a power vacuum, and into that power vacuum came Islam. And so Muhammad was born in 570 AD. He's a religious leader in the pagan city of Mecca. He only makes 70 converts in 12 years, gets confrontational. They chase him out of town for disturbing the peace. He goes north as a refugee to a Jewish city called Medina. They let him in as a Muslim immigrant, and he presents his faith and they reject it. And so he goes into the minority neighborhoods and he begins to organize a following, like a community organizer. And when his following gets big enough, he goes to the 3 Jewish tribes that control Medina and he pressured them into a treaty. Now Muhammad's a political leader. When Muhammad's followers in Mecca get confrontational, they get chased out of town for disturbing the peace. Now there's lots of Muslim refugees, and they come into Medina as lots of Muslim immigrants, and Muhammad allows them to rob the caravans headed back to Mecca in retaliation for them being kicked out. And so Muhammad becomes a military leader. He fights in 66 battles and raids in the next 8 years before he dies, killing around 3,000 people. And so when he dies, you have Caliph Abu Bakr takes over, and then Caliph Uthman and Caliph Ali and Caliph Muawiyah. And an important item is called the stirrup. And it was invented by the Mongolian nomads over by China, little short horses. They'd tie a rope around the horse, leave 2 loops hanging for their big toes. They would ride barefoot, help them keep balance. That invention made its way to China, across the Gobi Desert to Persia, and the Persians made the stirrups out of metal and leather straps. And then another invention called the scimitar sword. So the Byzantine Romans were using heavy metal swords that would take 2 hands, where The scimitar sword was made of Damascus steel. It's where you take the metal and bend it back on top of itself in the hot furnace and hammer it down and keep bending it and hammer it down and bending it, hammer it down. It gets thinner and thinner and stronger like a razor blade. And so they could hold the reins of the horse in one hand with their feet in the stirrups. And then with their scimitar sword at a full gallop, they literally could slice someone in half. And so the Muslims got a hold of this invention before the rest of the world did. And so they were able to be victorious on the battlefield. One of the Muslim leaders was nicknamed the Drawn Sword of Allah. He was undefeated in 100 battles. So they attacked the Persians, and then Persia becomes Islamic, and then they attacked the Byzantine Empire. So Jerusalem had been a Byzantine city from 325 AD Constantine up until around 648 AD, and that's when it's conquered by Caliph Umar. And then Syria was the first country that was completely Christian. The name Christian started in Syria. The Apostle Paul evangelized Syria until Caliph Umar conquered it around 648 AD. And then they invaded Egypt. Egypt had been completely Christian from the time the Apostle Mark had evangelized it until Amir ibn al-As invaded Egypt in the 640s. And then there used to be 250 Catholic dioceses. Of course, the whole world was still, the Christian world was one at this point, along North Africa. 250 dioceses. They're all conquered by the Umayyad Muslims, partly because the Christians had embraced pietism, their version of separation of church and state. It was this movement that if you really become a Christian, you should give away your money and live in a cave as a hermit or join a monastery. Or in Egypt, they called them desert fathers, where they would climb on a platform in the desert, bake in the sun, thinking they're denying their flesh and getting holier. But it was this withdrawal that allowed the Umayyad Muslims to conquer all of North Africa. And then in the year 711, 80,000 Muslims invaded Spain. Spain was a bunch of Visigothic Christian kingdoms that didn't get along, and they did the divide and conquer. They would conquer one kingdom and the others wouldn't come to its rescue because they viewed that kingdom as a competitor, and then they would conquer another. And in 10 years, they conquered all of Spain. And then they crossed the Pyrenees, and they were finally stopped at the Battle of Tours in 732 AD, just 100 years after the death of Muhammad in 632 AD. And so you had the Christians were begging the Catholic West for help. And from time to time, they would talk about coming to their rescue, but never did. So in around 668 AD, Constans II was the Byzantine emperor. And he goes from Constantinople to Rome. And he strips the gold off the Pantheon. And he's getting ready for a crusade to Egypt to try to rescue the Christians in Egypt. But he's in a jacuzzi and a slave breaks a soap dish over his head and kills him. It's one of the weird stories in history. Anyway, so the West just couldn't get it together. When the Muslims conquered North Africa so fast, it held back the ships of papyrus, which was paper. And so there's a paper shortage in Europe, and they write fewer books. We call this the beginning of the Dark Ages. And then you have the Turks. The Turks convert to Islam, and beginning in 1071, they begin to invade Turkey. And all 7 churches mentioned in the book of Revelation were wiped out by the Muslim Turks. First the Seljuk Turks and then the Ottoman Turks. And so as they're invading into Turkey, they get closer and closer to Constantinople. And so the Byzantine Christian Roman Empire West begins to beg the Catholics in the western part of Europe for help. In the year 1054 AD is when the Greek Orthodox and the Roman Catholics split. It was like called the Great Schism. It's the divorce of all divorces, right? It was over 2 words in the Nicene Creed. The Greeks said the Holy Spirit proceeded from the Father, and the Catholic West said the Holy Spirit proceeded from the Father and the Son. So in Greek, it's and son. And anyway, that was the divorce. And so the Byzantine Christians thought they were the true Christians because they spoke Greek, the language of the New Testament. But it was a big humbling of them to ask the West for help. And they finally send help. It's called the Crusades.
All right.
Well, here's the music.
Let's get to it right after the break with that background. We're talking to Dr. Bill Federer. We're talking about the Crusades. A lot more after the break. Don't go anywhere. Back in 2 minutes. The Crusades. When did they happen? Who ordered them? What happened on the Crusades? Were they commanded by God? Would God do this? We're talking about it with my friend Bill Federer. AmericanMinute.com is his website, ladies and gentlemen. AmericanMinute.com. He actually has a book related to this we're going to get into. And Bill, if I remember correctly, Muhammad died in 632 AD, as you mentioned. And by 638 AD, Muslims had taken over Jerusalem. And as you said, they went all the way across northern Africa, across the Straits of Gibraltar into Spain by 732 AD. And it was Charles Martel, Charles the Hammer, that prevented them from continuing further. But as you pointed out, the Muslim aggression continued into Turkey. And I think we left off right about 1054 before the break. Pick it up from there and then bring us on into the Crusades.
Sure. Well, a couple things to fill in. Mm-hmm. When the Muslims conquered Christian areas, they did not force the Christians to become Muslim. Why? Because it was the non-Muslims that paid the taxes. So Christians were called dhimmi, D-H-I-M-M-I, which is a second-class citizen that paid the taxes. And if it's sort of like a Jim Crow laws, and you had to ransom your life once a year. And if you ran out of money and couldn't ransom your life, they would take you and your family and sell you into slavery. This started when the Byzantine Christian patriarch of Jerusalem, when they were surrounded, swung this deal that said, look, as long as we ransom our lives, you won't kill us. Well, then you had the 772. Caliph al-Mansur ordered Jews and Christians to be branded on the hand. And then 822 AD, the Muslims destroyed the largest library in the world in Alexandria, Egypt. And then in 923 AD, Sharia Muslims began to destroy the church in Jerusalem. And then in the 830...
The Church of the Holy Sepulchre?
Well, churches in Jerusalem.
Oh, churches in Jerusalem.
It was in 937 AD that they plundered the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, the Church at Calvary, the Church of the Resurrection. 832 AD, 11,000 Muslims invaded Rome, Italy, and trashed the Basilica of St. Peter's and the bones of St. Peter. Then they trashed the church of St. Paul outside the walls, and they trashed the bones of St. Paul. And it was after that that Pope Leo decided to build the 39-foot wall around the Vatican. And so they were raiding the coasts of France, entire areas of Italy. They would abandon their city on the coast and move up into the mountains because of the Muslim attacks. Muslims would take and bring people into slavery into North Africa. They enslaved an estimated million or 2 million Europeans, but about 180 million Africans. So there were whole orders in Europe called the Trinitarians, and they would collect alms at church services to ransom back your friend who was captured by the Muslim pirates.
Did you say 180 million Africans?
Right, yeah. So that you
many?
had like 700 years of slavery.
Over 700 years.
Timbuktu was a big Muslim slave trading city where the canoe meets the caravan in Niger. Khartoum, Tanzania, the Zanzibar coast. These were all Muslim slave. Muhammad owned slaves. He owned black slaves. Muhammad was a white Arab. And so they would sell them throughout and then they in some areas, they would demand the Christians not just pay taxes, but pay taxes in their sons. It was called the Dev Shurma, the blood tax. And so every conquered village would have to give a half dozen or a dozen of their boys to the Muslims every year that they would train to be Janissary soldiers to attack the Christians. They were the first full-time army in Europe. In Egypt, they would capture the Christians and make them part of their cavalry called the Mamluks. And but then they had to convert and become Muslim. And then if they were handsome, pretty, they became coqueques, which was the sodomy of the Turks. I won't get into all that. In the year 1004, the Caliph al-Hakim bin Amir Allah began a 10-year persecution where thousands were forced to convert to Islam or die, and about 30,000 churches were destroyed. And Caliph al-Hakim destroyed the Church of the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem. So the church had been there. Christians were going on pilgrimage. They would come back to Europe and they would give reports about how the Christians are being treated. 1075, the Muslim Seljuk Turks captured Jerusalem from the Arab Muslims. There's two different types of Muslims. We got the Turkish Muslims and the Arabs. Gregory Bar Hebraeus, a Syrian Orthodox church leader, described what happened. He says that the Turkish Muslims, having seen very much modesty and other habits of this kind among the Christian people, they loved them at first, but then their love turned to intense hatred. And then they had reports of beheadings. You had the Vikings, which got called Normans. They captured Normandy, the central part of France, and then William the Norman conquered England in 1066. But Robert the Norman came down and captured Sicily and parts of Italy from the Muslims that they had captured. So you have this pushback from Christian Vikings. Years ago, I went to Constantinople or Istanbul, and we were at the big Hagia Sophia cathedral. And the second floor, they have a balcony and with a marble railing, and carved in there was a Viking graffiti, like these square type of letters and everything, because the Vikings had conquered Istanbul for a short time. Italian cities of Pisa, Genoa, Catalonia fought these Muslims' raid. Majorca, Sardinia, 1071, Muslims inflicted a major defeat on the Byzantine Christians at the Battle of Mazikert. And this is when they began to invade. And the Eastern Christians are begging the Western Christians for help. And so the first Byzantine emperor to call for help is Alexis I Komnenos. And again, he had to humble himself because the Greeks thought they were the true Christians and they viewed the Catholic West as the church split. Then you had the Muslims destroy churches, including the Church of St. Nicholas. So St. Nicholas was the most popular Greek saint. St. Nicholas is to Greek Orthodox what St. Peter is to Roman Catholics. He lived during Roman times, gave to the poor, but they moved his bones to Italy in the year 1087. And so now the Pope, Urban II, is receiving the bones of the most popular Greek saints. And he's like, okay, this is getting serious. And so Pope Urban II goes to the Council of Clermont and begs them to send help to the Greeks. And he gave a speech, and it's recorded. He says the invading Islamists compel them to extend their necks, and then attacking them with naked swords, attempt to cut through the neck in a single blow. That was reported by Robert the Monk in the medieval source book, which is kept at Fordham University. So Spain, they had crusades for 700 years, and they drove the Muslims out of Toledo and Leon, and finally from Granada. And so Spain is fighting their crusades, and they thought, okay, well, let's get a crusade to drive the Muslims out of the Holy Land, which all used to be Christian. So the first crusade, they show up to Alexis I Komnenos. He expected them to say, we're here to help, where do you need us? But instead, they take sort of the attitude of, we're here, we'll be in charge. And they said, we want the golden apple. We want Jerusalem. And whereas Alexis I Komnenos said, look, I just want to capture the next town and then work our way back to Jerusalem. But the Western Crusaders are like, no, we'll do this. And they do. They capture Jerusalem, but they have not captured the land in between. So all they have is this tenuous supply line. But for 100 years, these Crusaders control the Holy Land. And they have, their kingdoms, and they're set it up. And but the Muslims are disorganized. But then you have their leaders begin to coalesce, Saladin and others. So
Bill,
you
let me ask you a couple of things about Pope Urban II, who ordered this crusade now in 1095 AD. I'm reading, and I just want to get your take on it, that in a speech you just mentioned, the Council of Clermont in 1095, he promised significant spiritual rewards to those who joined the First Crusade, and his primary promise was the remission of sins, a full absolution for all past sins for those who had participated in the crusade with genuine devotion. And he assured that even those who died during the campaign, whether in battle or on the journey, would receive immediate forgiveness and eternal salvation. Sounds a lot like almost like an indulgence. Like, it's not by faith alone. If you do this, you're going to be absolved, and you're going to make it right to eternal life. Is that what he actually did?
Yeah. So this is what 5 centuries before the Reformation.
Yes, of course.
And so this is 4 centuries before the invention of the printing press. Mm-hmm. Martin Luther was not even allowed to read the Bible till after he became a priest. And so the biblical knowledge of the common person was relatively low. And so, the Pope, the attitude was that all the good works that people did were sort of saved up, and he could dispense them. This is why Martin Luther wrote his 95 Thesis, to say, well, if he can dispense all these good works, why doesn't he just do it out of the goodness of his heart? Why does he need contributions? Anyway. But you are right. They did make these promises that are not based on Scripture.
Well, this is what we forget here living in the West. We have Bibles all over our house. We have it on our phone. We have it everywhere. We take it for granted that, well, why didn't they just read the Bible and realize that they could have been saved by faith, or by grace through faith, not of works? They don't have to go on a crusade in order to earn eternal life. I mean, this sounds a lot like jihad, which is the only sure way to know you're making it to paradise, according to Islam. You can, if you die as a martyr in jihad, you're in. It's what this sounds like.
Yeah. So with the Crusaders' knowledge of the Scriptures was relatively low. They were promised these things. Now, it's a little bit different. In Islam, they promise if you die in jihad, you'll go to paradise, but their paradise is 72 virgins. But,
right. Well, we'll pick it up right after the break. We're talking to Bill Federer. We're getting the context set before we talk about specifically what happened on the Crusades, so don't go anywhere. You're listening to I Don't Have Enough Faith to Be an Atheist with me, Frank Turek. By the way, it's also a podcast by the same name, I Don't Have Enough Faith to Be an Atheist. Back in 2 minutes. The Crusades, what were they? Why were they ordered? Who ordered them? What happened on the Crusades? We're talking to my friend, the historian Bill Federer. A lot more with Bill in just a second. I want to point out that this weekend I'll be at Grace Church St. Louis. That's in Maryland Heights, Missouri. I think there's a Saturday night service and then all the services in the morning. Details are on our website, crossexamine.org. Then Monday night, we're continuing our series, The Bible You Never Knew. We're going to be talking more about Joseph and then on into Moses. These characters actually prefigure Christ. They're types of Christ. The entire Bible points to Christ. And it's amazing when you really look at their lives, how much or how many similarities there are between the lives of these people, whether it's Isaac, whether it's Joseph, whether it's Moses, whether it's Jonah, on and on and on, how those similarities between them and Jesus just float to the top of the page once you really see them. Also want to mention that the following week, I'll be out in California at Godspeak Calvary Chapel. That's near Thousand Oaks, California. That's the night of the 15th and all day on the 16th. All the services there. And then we'll be at Wayne State University in Detroit, Michigan, Wednesday, March 19th. The following week, we're going to be at Mississippi State University on the 27th. Keep an eye out for that, and a lot more coming up in April. We'll tell you about that when we get closer. But let me go back to my friend, the great Bill Federer. Bill, tell people there's so much intriguing material that you're presenting to us here. Is this written down somewhere? I mean, you have a book that discusses a lot of this, doesn't it?
Right. So it's called What Every American Needs to Know About the Quran, A History of Islam and the United States. And all right. So a lot of fascinating stuff. Interesting, the Rock of Gibraltar. Mm-hmm. Well, Jabal is Arabic for mountain, and Tariq was the name of the Muslim general that invaded Spain in the year 711 with his 80,000 men. And they crossed the strait and landed at this mountain. So they called it the mountain of this Muslim general Tariq. So Jabal Tariq. So over the years, Jabal Tariq got pronounced Gibraltar.
Oh, all right.
And anyway, so the Song of Roland, it's considered one of the very first French pieces of literature. But it talks about how you have Charles Martel stopped the Muslims from invading France. And one of his generals was ambushed and all of the men were killed. And so that turns into this tragic poem called the Song of Roland. And then El Cid. So Spain was a bunch of kingdoms, and El Cid was the leader of one of them. And he had rallied his men to fight the Muslims, and he was wounded, but he knew they just needed one more charge. Charlton Heston, Sophia Loren did the movie. I met Charlton Heston a long time ago. He endorsed me when I ran for Congress. Anyway, so Charlton Heston is El Cid, and he's wounded, but he knows just one more charge and they'll win. So he tells him to strap his body to the horse with a board up his back, and then they slap his horse and open the gates of the castle, and he rides off, and all the men ride off behind him, and they fight and they win. And then after the victory, there's like, where's El Cid? And he's like, drooped over his horse. And it's one of those chick flicks,
Sure,
anyway,
yeah. Wait a minute, Bill. I can't let this go because you actually had Moses endorse you for Congress. That's pretty good.
Yeah. He was the head of the NRA at the time. And so you had these Christians begging for help. And so, again, the First Crusade was 1095. And then you had the Second Crusade. So the First Crusade worked, excuse me, and you had the Christian Catholic West control the Holy Land. Godfrey of de Bouillon, he was in charge. It lasted for 100 years, and then it fell. And then you had Bernard of Clairvaux in 1147 calling for a second crusade. It was led by King Louis VII and Conrad II, and it failed to take Damascus. They returned to Europe.
So the Christians still had Jerusalem. It took them, 2 years to go from Rome to Jerusalem and take Jerusalem, or 4 years? When did they take it? Like 1099?
Yes, yeah, and so it. There's a whole history of the kingdom, and then the European kings would maintain those titles, even though they didn't have control of Jerusalem. But and so then the Second Crusade failed. Bernard of Clairvaux was disturbed to hear of the mistreatment of the Jews. So sadly, some of the Crusaders, they could not tell the difference between a Jew or an Arab over in the Middle East. I know that it seems strange, but and the same thing with some of the Egyptian Christians called Coptics, mm-hmm. and even some of the Armenian Christians that have lasted, through the centuries. And so these Crusaders were Western Christians, and they viewed anything that was Eastern with suspicion. Third Crusade, you have the Frederick of Prussia, or Frederick Barbarossa. He's a German. Barbarossa means Redbeard. And so he's going with two other kings, Philip II of France and Richard I of England, and they're going to try to take back Turkey and then Jerusalem. And they've got 100,000 men. It looks like it's going to be a successful crusade. But as they're crossing a river in Turkey, the horse bucks, Barbossa falls off and drowns in 2 feet of water because he's wearing heavy metal armor, and the people all can't get off their horses in time to get him out of the water, and he dies. And so the crusade is confused. A bunch of the Germans go back, and so now it's just Richard and Philip. And they're laying siege. You have the Muslim leader Saladin, and he is now in control of Jerusalem. He swings a deal. It's quite interesting when you read the records. Richard is in the plain, and he's amazed that after all the fighting, the Muslims still have their soldiers on the walls of Jerusalem, not realizing that Saladin was propping dead bodies up. and they're standing at attention. And then it's really hot. And so Saladin takes some snow and puts it in a chest and has his men delivered to Richard in the valley, like, oh, here's some ice to, keep you cool. So it's sort of a mind, game. And one day, Richard wakes up and Philip of France is gone. And he's going back to France to try to take Normandy, which was an area controlled by Richard the Lionheart. And so Richard tries to swing a quick deal and go back to Europe. He makes it so that all the Christians will be released from Jerusalem, but if they couldn't pay their ransom, Saladin wouldn't let them go, and he sold them into slavery, thousands of them. And then Richard's on his way back to Europe. His ship gets wrecked. He decides to go back across land, but he has to go through some kingdoms of some of the other generals that he offended because, they capture a castle and the other soldiers would put their flag, their standard up, and Richard would throw it down and put up his standard. And so he wasn't somebody that you got along well. But now he has to cross through their kingdoms, and he's captured, and he's put in a jail cell in a tower. And they're trying to find out where he's at. And so his minstrel named Blondel leaves England and going across Europe singing Richard's favorite song from town to town, castle to castle. And then he's in this one, he sings it, and Richard hears it and sings the refrain. And so that's how they know what castle he was in. And they have to raise a king's ransom to get him out. And so who's back in charge of England but his brother, King John? And so King John has to raise taxes to get the money to free Richard. And so this is the story of Robin Hood, right? This King John, he's raising taxes and not realizing that the taxes are used to ransom. Richard is ransomed, comes back, rules for 5 years. He's killed, taken back a castle in Normandy that Philip II had got. And so now King John, his brother King John is in charge of England, and he is oppressive, and he is surrounded and forced to sign the Magna Carta in 1215 AD to recognize the rights of the civilians. So that's a famous document, the Magna Carta. And then you have the Fourth Crusade, which was a fiasco. The Doge of Venice, that's like the Duke, and he raises money, and he realizes that he's not going to recoup it. Because there's not a lot of money left to Jerusalem. And so he stops off in Constantinople, and the people in Constantinople have this great chain that goes across the harbor so ships can't get in. But they see all these ships from Europe, and they're like, okay, they've helped us with 3 other crusades, and so they let the chain down, and they come in, and the Fourth Crusade rapes and pillages Constantinople. And so the Venetians take over Constantinople for like 57 years, and they take all the gold that they can, ship it back to Venice, Italy. And so that's when Venice gets really wealthy, and now Constantinople, the Byzantine Empire, is bankrupt. And so the Muslims will come into a town and say, hey, your emperor is making you pay money. If you let us take over your town, you won't have to pay taxes. And they're like, really? Promise? Yes. As soon as they let him happen, they say, we lied. You not only have to pay taxes, you're going to have to give up your sons to put as janissaries. And that was sad. Now we're up to the Fifth Crusade. the fourth consul of Lateran proposed this crusade with the force of Hungary and Austria joining, and they to take back Jerusalem 1219. They capture an area in Egypt, but they made the mistake of attacking Cairo, and the Sultan Malik el-Kamini, brother of Saladin, opens the dams of the Nile, forcing the Crusaders to retreat. During this time, you have St. Francis of Assisi. He leaves Assisi in Italy. I've been there. It's a beautiful little town on the top of a mountain there. But he leaves Assisi and he goes over to Egypt, and he's going to witness to the Sultan. And they're like, you're crazy. But he begins to walk across no man's land. And the story is that like a tiger charged him, but then sat down at his feet and he petted it. And so these Muslims like, this is a holy man. So he goes in there and he witnesses to the Sultan and tells him that he wants to convert him to Christianity. And the Sultan's like, not sure. And he challenges them to walk through a fire. He says, you have your imams walk through the fire. I'll walk through the fire. Whoever comes out alive on the other side, you'll believe, right? And the imams are like, no, let's not do this. And so the Sultan says, look, I'll give you some gold. You're a courageous guy. He says, no, I don't want gold. I want your soul. And he says, well, pray for me. And anyway, he leaves. And so that's the Fifth Crusade.
All right, we'll pick it up right after the break. This is exciting stuff. We're talking the Crusades, ladies and gentlemen, with Bill Federer. AmericanMinute.com, AmericanMinute.com. Much more on the I Don't Have Enough Faith to Be an Atheist radio program and podcast. Back in 2. If you've been fascinated by our discussion today, as I have been, regarding the Crusades, you can get Bill Federer's book on Islam, and it will help you understand what every American needs to know about Islam. That's the name of it. What every American needs to know about Islam, Bill?
Whatever American needs to know about the Quran, the history of Islam in the United States.
Okay, all right. Whatever American needs to know about the Quran. Before we go on, we probably won't get through all the Crusades here, but I want to read something from John Dixon's book, Bullies and Saints. John Dixon's an historian, and that book, Bullies and Saints, is quite a good book. And this is apparently an eyewitness speaking about the First Crusade when they got to Jerusalem. He said this: wonderful sights were to be seen. Some of our men cut off the heads of their enemies. Others shot them with arrows so that they fell from the towers. Others tortured them longer by casting them into the flames. Piles of heads, hands, and feet were seen in the streets of the city. It was a just and splendid judgment of God that this place would be filled with the blood of the unbelievers, since it had suffered so long from their blasphemies, unquote. Now, as we mentioned earlier in the program, this crusader probably never had read the Bible because the Bible was not available. But he, since the Pope said, you're going to be absolved from your sins if you go on this crusade and you go to Jerusalem and you defeat the enemies, everything's going to be great. This crusader decided this was valid judgment, and to torture these people was a good thing. This obviously was not commanded by God. It goes against the teachings of Jesus. However, there was a military reason to liberate Jerusalem from the Muslims, but carrying it out this way was not the way to do it. Bill, what was if we could put into the heads of people what we now call just war theory, why was a crusade properly done something that could be considered a just war?
Well, there were reports coming back of Christians being drugged to the altars of the churches and have their throats slit. In India, they would build pyramids of skulls. The Ghazis would go in there, and so these reports go back to Europe. And the thought was that if you're really Christian, how can you sit back and say, look, they're Greek Orthodox and you're Roman Catholic, but you're not going to come to their rescue because of a religious difference. You need to go and protect them. Rescue the orphan and the widow. Now, we cannot endorse everything they did in battle, You go into battle, and they're young people, young men, and they're fighting, and you have all the passions, and so there's atrocities done on both sides that cannot be defended. But as far as the big picture goes, the Crusades bought Europe 2 centuries. Had they not happened, the Muslim armies would have invaded Eastern Europe 2 centuries earlier. Once the Crusades ended, they did invade Eastern Europe, and they did conquer half of Eastern Europe. They invaded Hungary and Albania and Serbia and all these different countries, and held them captive for centuries. And but had the Crusades not happened, they would have had 2 centuries earlier to do it, and they probably would have conquered Europe from the east the same way they conquered Spain in just 10 years, because they were they had the stirrup and the scimitar sword, where most of the Europeans were still fighting on foot with heavy metal swords. And, Charles Martel was the first one that learned how to make a stirrup in Europe and begin to fight on horseback. So, so a lot of terrible things happened in the war.
Bill, we know from Romans 13 that the purpose of government is to protect innocent people from evil. And it even says in there that the leader, the king, doesn't bear the sword for nothing. In other words, a just ruler uses force to protect innocent people from evil. Now go back to 1095, the First Crusade. Why is the Pope ordering a crusade rather than a legitimate government, or was the Pope and the government the same thing at the time?
Yeah, Europe was lots of kingdoms, hundreds of kingdoms. Now, when the Muslims invaded into Spain, conquered it in 10 years, crossed the Pyrenees, conquered southern France, they're stopped by Charles Martel. His son is Pepin the Short, and his grandson is Charlemagne. And so the Pope crowns Charlemagne as the Holy Roman Emperor, which means you have double duty. Not just are you supposed to protect France, you're supposed to protect all of Christendom. So the Crusades gave Europe the concept of Europe, of Christendom. Europe didn't see itself as Europe. It saw itself as a bunch of kingdoms, and they didn't get along. But now with this Islamic threat, they began to say, wait a second, there's something that trans all of us, and it's Christianity. And so we're going to call it Christendom. And the Holy Roman Emperor's job is to protect Europe from Islamic invasion. And so that's Charles Martel. The Pope goes to this Council of Clermont with all these kings, with the Holy Roman Emperor at the time, and begs them for help. And he doesn't organize, he just gives the plea. And then it's the European kings that take up the torch and say, we have to come to the rescue. Even today, you have people saying, look, we got to go and get involved in this war on the other side of the world, right? And they're trying to justify it. Now, the Sixth Crusade is interesting because it was done through negotiation. It was Frederick I, and he was the Holy Roman Emperor, and 1228 AD. He goes over and he agrees diplomatically to get back Jerusalem and Nazareth and Bethlehem. But he had offended the Pope by not fulfilling a vow, and so he was excommunicated. And the Pope said, since he was a bad guy and he negotiated this deal, we're not going to honor the deal. It's like, you could have just, it's like, you could have traded mineral rights and ended the war right then. But no, so that was sad. Then you have Genghis Khan, and he conquers from Korea to Hungary to Russia, kills 30 million people. And now we have a third entity in the Crusade picture. We have the Christian West, we have the Islamic Turks, and now we have the Mongols. And so the Mongols invade, and there's even letters between the King Louis of France and the Muslim Khan saying, "Hey, let's team up together against the Muslims." So the
Muslims are teaming up against Muslims?
No, excuse me, the Mongols.
Oh, the Mongols. Okay, so
I'm looking at the clock, trying to see how much information I can squeeze in. And
what year is this, Bill? What year is this?
So this is like 1250.
Okay, all right.
So it's Hulagu Khan. He's the grandson of Genghis Khan, and he destroys the Muslim caliphate in Baghdad. And he is having to face the assassins. So the Muslims, they would fight you in battle, but they had a second thing, and it was they would get people high on hashish, soldiers, take them to a harem where they'd have a good time. They'd pass out, and then they would take them back where they took them from. And then they said, you just went to paradise. And if you die killing this Muslim leader, you'll go back to this sex party. And so they called them hashashins because they smoked hashish. And so the word hashashin got later pronounced assassin. So the very word assassin is an Islamic word of Muslims that would sneak in. So they would sneak into the Mongolian camp and try to assassinate the leader. And then they would wait to get killed because they thought that they did their job and then they were going to go to paradise. And so then you had the Seventh Crusade, and it's led by King Louis IX of France, and he's nicknamed St. Louis. If you go to St. Louis, Missouri, where I'm born, on the big park in downtown, it's called Art Hill, and there's a statue of St. Louis on his Crusader horse. And he led the 7th and 8th Crusades. Then you have Marco Polo, and he goes from Venice, Italy, over to China, and he's working for Kublai Khan, the grandson of Genghis Khan, and he comes back to Europe. And then you have the thugs. These were Muslims that would attack caravans and kill them all and keep control. Then you had the 9th Crusade, 1271. Edward I, the future king of England, undertook the 9th Crusade to help Syria. He accomplished little, made a truce the following year. Tripoli in present-day Lebanon fell to the Mamluk Sultan, 1289, and then Acre fell, and then finally the last stages of Christian rule ended in 1291. And so once the supply lines were cut off, the kingdoms, and if you go to, I've been to Israel once, but they can show you the hill of Hattim, where they basically, they had rushed into Jerusalem and Capernaum, and they went to the Crusaders. They said, quick, send help. And so these guys just drop what they're doing and ride out, not doing any, surveillance. And they go up to this hill, and they're surrounded by like 100,000 Muslims. And they just fight. They're all dead. And that's the end of the Crusades. So St. Thomas Aquinas lived during this time. And he said, Muhammad seduced the people by promises of carnal pleasure, to which the concupiscence of the flesh goads us, and he gave free rein to carnal pleasure. In all this, it was not unexpected, as he was obeyed by carnal men. And he goes on to talk about how he was able to get men to follow him by promising them paradise filled full of virgins. And
well, ladies and gentlemen, if there is one difference, even Jordan Peterson admitted this, between Jesus and Muhammad, we can say for sure Jesus was no warlord, but Muhammad was. Bill, this is so fascinating. People need to get your book, What Every American Needs to Know About the Quran, A History of Islam in the United States, and also go to AmericanMinute.com. Bill, I can't thank you enough for doing this program. There's so much more to learn, but we're running out of time.
Yeah, I actually put in there a comparison of Jesus and Muhammad. Jesus never led armies. Muhammad did. Jesus never married. Muhammad had 11 to 22 wives. Jesus never tortured anybody. Muhammad did. Anyway, but it's a great book. I think people will find it interesting. What every American needs to know about the Quran, history of Islam in the United States. My website, AmericanMinute.com.
Check it out, ladies and gentlemen. And I will, Lord willing, be in St. Louis this weekend. Go to our website for more. And Lord willing, we will see you here at the Midweek Podcast. God bless.
If you're looking for solid answers to life's biggest questions, don't miss the latest episode of I Don't Have Enough Faith to Be an Atheist. Find it on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Pandora, iHeart, OnePlace, and Podchaser. Tune in, discover the truth, and share it with someone who needs it. Let's keep spreading the truth together.